Okay, so picture this. It's the year 625. The Muslim community in Medina is, facing a truly existential threat.
The Battle of Ub.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The Meccans are marching on the city and everyone is mobilizing. Men are grabbing swords, putting on armor. And in the middle of all this, a 13-year-old boy walks up to the Prophet Muhammad.
Right.
He's literally standing on his tiptoes, trying to look taller, trying to look like a warrior. He begs for a sword.
And the Prophet just looks at him, sees he's just a kid, and sends him home.
Sends him home. In that culture, for a young man, that must have been just devastating.
Oh, it's a profound rejection. In 7th century Arabia, manhood is all about your ability to fight, to defend your family. Being sent back to the women and children while your father marches off to die, it's a defining moment.
But that's the paradox, isn't it?
Yeah.
And this is really the core of what we're digging into today. That rejected kid, a boy who's too young for the battle line, he grows up to become a giant.
A giant of Islamic law.
We're talking about Abu Sa'd al-Khudri. By the time he dies, he is the 7th most prolific narrator of hadith in all of history.
That's it. We are looking at a figure who is just this critical node in the whole network of Islamic history. Abu Sa'd is the source for over 1,170 traditions.
1,170.
He shapes how millions of people pray, how they do business, even how they imagine the end of the world.
And that number, 11 to 170, that's exactly where we have to start. Because when you look at the timeline in the source material, the math just feels incredibly tight. It raises what you called in your notes epistemic risk.
That is the core issue, yes. It's about the very foundations of knowledge. When the Prophet died, Abu Sa'd was what, maybe 15 or 16 years old?
A teenager.
A teenager. So the question is, how does a teenager become the primary authority for over 1,000 distinct legal and theological statements?
So that's our mission for this deep dive. We are going to unpack that. We'll look at the numbers game, the statistical weirdness that historians point to. We have to talk about the notebook controversy.
Which is a fantastic irony.
Oh, it's a huge one. And then we have to get into the sectarian tug of war over him. And finally, the really hard texts, the narrations on gender and slavery that are so challenging today.
And to do that, we're pulling from a really diverse stack. We've got the classical biographies like al-Dahabi, but we're also reading them against modern critical historians, Shia critiques, and Quranist arguments.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. Uhud. Who was this kid?
His name was Sa'd ibn Malik. We know him by his kunya, Abu Sa'id. He was an Andari, so from one of the local Medinan tribes that welcomed the Prophet. And that moment at Uhud, it just defines everything. He's sent home.
But his father isn't.
His father, Malik, stays. He fights. And he's martyred in that battle.
So at 13, he goes from being a rejected volunteer to basically the man of the house in a community at war.
Exactly. And they were poor. Truly destitute.
Yeah.
There's a famous story about him, often used to show his character, where he's so hungry he ties a stone to his stomach just to deal with the pain.
Wow.
And he goes to the Prophet to ask for, some charity. But before he can even speak, the Prophet starts giving a sermon on the virtue of self-reliance, the dignity of not begging.
He takes the hint?
He takes the hint. He turns around, walks away, doesn't ask for a thing. And that really establishes his reputation. He's stoic. He's inside the circle, even as a youth.
But let's apply some pressure to this numbers game. Over 1,100 narrations. When secular historians look at that age-to-volume ratio, what's the actual critique?
The critique is statistical, it's probabilistic. If you look at the senior companions, men like Abu Bakr or Umar, who were with the Prophet for decades, his peers.
They have far fewer hadiths attributed to them.
Far fewer. Abu Bakr, his closest friend, has fewer than 150 in most collections.
Okay, hold on. The Prophet's best friend, there for everything, has 150.
Yeah.
The teenager who came along late has over 1,000.
Right. And that's where skeptics argued that this suggests a process of back projection.
Okay, back projection. Break that down for us, because that's a term that comes up a lot in historical criticism.
It is. The idea, and this is associated with scholars like Schacht or Joinbull, is that as legal schools were forming in the 8th, 9th centuries,
they needed authority.
They needed authority for their new rulings. You can't just, say, well, I think this is the law. You need to be able to say the Prophet said it.
So they needed a source, a reliable name to attach it to.
Exactly. But you can't just attribute some complex legal point to Abu Bakr if the tradition knows he didn't narrate much. But a younger companion, someone who lived a really long life and taught for 50 years, he's the perfect vehicle.
So the theory is that later jurists, attributed their own legal ideas backward in time onto Abu Sa'id to give them legitimacy.
That's the critical view, yes.
But the Sunni tradition knows how old he was. It's not a secret. So what's the internal defense? How do they account for a teenager knowing so much?
The defense is actually pretty practical. It's about the mechanics of an oral culture. First, longevity. Abu Sa'id lived a long time, till around 74 AH. That means he taught in Medina for 50 years after the Prophet's death. He became an institution.
He just outlived everyone else. So if you wanted to know something, he was the guy you had to go to.
He was the go-to source by default. But there's a really important technical point, too. It's called Mursal al-Sahabi. In hadith science, it was seen as perfectly fine for a companion to say, "The Prophet said," even if they didn't hear it directly.
As long as they heard it from another senior companion they trusted.
Precisely. So when he says the Prophet said, he might actually mean Omar told me that the Prophet said. He's acting as a hub, aggregating the collective memory of the whole community.
And I suppose that 1170 number includes a lot of repetitions too. The same story told to different students.
Many repetitions. If he tells the same story to 5 students, later compilers might count that as 5 separate traditions. So the number is a bit inflated.
That makes sense. But it leads us straight into what I found to be an even bigger puzzle, the notebook controversy.
Ah, yes. This is probably the greatest irony of his entire legacy.
Because Abu Sa'id is the main narrator for that very famous, very specific hadith where the Prophet says, "Do not write anything from me, and whoever writes anything but the Quran, let him erase it."
An explicit, categorical ban on writing down his teachings.
And we are reading this ban in a giant book
Yeah.
full of his written down teachings attributed to the guy who narrated the ban. It feels like a total logical contradiction.
It is a loop, you're right. And
Yep.
for modern Quranists, this narration is the absolute smoking gun.
And just to be clear for everyone listening, Quranists are the group who believe the Quran is the only source of authority, and they reject the hadith collections.
That's right. They point right to this report from Abu Sa'id and say, "See? The Prophet himself forbade creating these books. The entire hadith project is a violation of his own command."
From a purely textual point of view, that's a powerful argument. How does mainstream Sunni scholarship get around that? Don't write this, followed by libraries full of writing.
The standard answer is the concept of nesk, or abrogation. The argument is that this ban was temporary. It was from the very early days in Medina.
Why?
The fear was that people would mix up the Quranic revelation with the Prophet's everyday commentary. If you're writing both down on the same piece of parchment, they could get confused.
So once the Quran was memorized, codified, and clearly distinct, the danger was over and the ban was lifted.
That's the argument. They say it was abrogated, and they point to other companions who did keep notes, or sahifas. But secular historians, they see something else. They see a culture war.
A war between oral memory and written text.
Exactly. The 7th and 8th centuries were this transition period. The old guard deeply believed that knowledge belonged in the heart, in memory. That's a living word. Writing was the dead letter.
It's very Socratic, isn't it? The idea that writing things down makes your memory weak.
Precisely. And Abu Sa'id is standing right in the middle of that tension. He's the one preserving the oral ban on writing, even as his own students are, dipping their pens in ink to record what he's saying.
That tension between eras, that brings us to the political world he had to survive in. You don't get to teach for 50 years in Medina without navigating the civil wars, the fitna.
And this is where he gets a fascinating label from some historians, the silent partisan.
It sounds like a contradiction in terms.
Yeah.
How can you be partisan and silent?
Because it describes the arc of his life. At first, he was very clearly aligned with Ali, the Prophet's cousin. Abu Sa'id fought for Ali in the civil war battles at Affan and Naharawan.
So he wasn't neutral. He picked a side and was willing to fight for it.
Early on, yes. But then the politics changed violently. Ali was assassinated and the Umayyad dynasty took over. They were an imperial monarchy, and they were explicitly hostile to Ali's memory and his family.
And Abu Sa'id is still living in Medina, now under their rule.
He is, and he goes quiet. He shifts from being a soldier to being a scholar. He adopts this policy of, let's call it pious non-resistance.
There's that really disturbing story in the sources about the Battle of Al-Lara. This was years later, when the Umayyad army actually sacked Medina.
A truly horrific event. Yazid's army invaded the Prophet's city, and Abu Sa'id, an old man by then, doesn't fight. The sources say he hid in a cave. When a Syrian soldier found him, sword out, Abu Sa'id just sat there. He didn't move.
He chose complete pacifism.
He did. But this creates a huge divide in how he's seen. For Shia scholars, who of course venerate Ali, their relationship with Abu Sa'd is very complicated.
Because he stopped fighting for their side.
It's not just that, it's about what's missing from his narrations. If you read the big Sunni books, Abu Sa'd narrates all these details about prayer and fasting and trade, but there are almost no reports where he champions Ali's political rights.
If he was a loyalist, why wasn't he telling stories that supported his leader?
That's the million-dollar question. And Shia scholars have a theory for it. They call it the theory of filtering.
Meaning?
They argue that he probably did narrate traditions praising Ali, but because he was living under Umayyad rule, those stories were suppressed.
So either he was too scared to say them out loud, or the people writing them down were too scared to include them.
Precisely. So the Abu Sa'd we have left in the Sunni books is the safe Abu Sa'd, the neutral legal expert who talks about rituals, not revolution.
That's a huge implication. It suggests that what we think of as sacred history might just be what was politically safe to say at the time.
History is always in some way written by the survivors. And under the Umayyads, surviving often meant being quiet about certain things.
Well, he certainly didn't stay quiet on everything. And I think this is where we have to pivot to the toughest part of this whole discussion. We need to talk about the hard texts.
Yes, the narrations about women and about slavery.
Abu Sa'd is the source for some of the most controversial hadiths out there. Let's start with the deficiency narration.
This is the report where, according to him, the prophet is speaking to a group of women and describes them as being deficient in intellect and religion. Naqisat al-Quwadin.
I read the full text. It's stark. And it's used constantly by critics to argue that the tradition is inherently misogynistic. How do modern believers, people who aren't trying to reject the tradition, deal with a text like that?
It is a major flashpoint. The standard modern defense is to get very technical with the words. They argue deficiency, nuqsan, isn't a general insult about intelligence. They say deficient in intellect is a specific legal term.
Referring to what?
Referring to the rule at the time that, in financial contracts, the testimony of 2 women was equivalent to 1 man's. And deficient in religion, they argue, refers to the fact that women are exempt from prayer during their menstrual cycle.
So the argument is, it's not an ontological statement about women's souls. It's a technical description of legal and ritual obligations.
That's the apologetic argument, yes.
Does that really work for historians or critical scholars?
For the most part, no. Feminist scholars and historians see that as special pleading. They argued the text is a very clear window into 7th century patriarchal norms. You can't just reinterpret the plain meaning of the words away to make them fit modern values. They see him as a conduit for the gender hierarchy of his time.
And it gets even darker when we turn to slavery. The hadith from the Battle of Banu al-Mutan.
The narration about al-Azl, yes. Coitus interruptus.
The context, as I understand it, is that Muslim soldiers had taken women captive. They wanted to have sexual relations with them, but they also wanted to ransom them back to their families for money. So they didn't want them to get pregnant.
Correct. So they asked the prophet if it was permissible to practice withdrawal to prevent conception.
And what's so jarring is that the underlying premise that they had a right to sexual access to these captive women was just a given. That wasn't even the question.
No, it was the norm of warfare across the ancient world. But for any modern reader, the act being described is sexual violence. It's the definition of war, rape.
So how do you deal with that? How can a pious narrator be the source for a text that seems to regulate and therefore permit what we now see as a war crime?
It forces a choice between reading the text as timeless law versus reading it as a historical document. Modern reformist scholars say this is a record of how people behaved 1,400 years ago, not a moral command for today. They argue the religion's overall direction was towards ending slavery, even if it took time.
But the text itself isn't condemning it. It's just discussing contraception.
And that's exactly why critics see it as an indelible moral problem. Abu Sa'd is the one who preserves this record. He is the link in the chain. And it reminds us that these texts come from a world with fundamentally different moral assumptions than our own.
It's heavy. And it feels strange to switch gears to that.
Yeah.
We have to touch on the, let's call it the sci-fi element of his legacy.
The eschatology, the end times.
Right. He is a huge source for prophecies about the Mahdi and the Antichrist, the Dajjal. But there's this one detail that just jumped out at me. 70,000 Jews from Isfahan.
Yes. He narrates that the Dajjal's army will be made up of 70,000 Jews from the city of Isfahan wearing Persian shawls.
why Isfahan? Of all the places in the world, why there? It's so specific.
And historians would call that geographic anxiety. Isfahan was a major city in Persia. In the early Islamic Empire, as they conquered eastward, there was immense tension between the Arab rulers and the much older Persian civilization.
So the bad guys in the apocalypse just happen to look like the geopolitical rivals of the day.
That's the secular analysis, yeah. It suggests that Abu Sa'd is maybe reflecting the folklore and the fears of the time, the anxiety about a Persian resurgence. Historians also see the influence of Jewish and Christian apocalyptic stories that were all over the Near East.
He's like a sponge, just absorbing everything around him.
He is. He's absorbing law, politics, and even the fears of the community. And look how the different sects use it. The Shia take his Mahdi narrations and reread them to be about their specific 12th Imam. Sunnis read them as being about a general future leader. They're both using Abu Sa'id's memory, but they're cutting and pasting it to fit their own theology.
It all comes back to where we started. This one man, the teenager at Uhud, the silent scholar in the cave, the narrator of these incredibly difficult laws and these wild prophecies. When you pull the camera back, what are we really looking at?
I think we're looking at the fragility of memory itself. Abu Sa'id al-Khudri isn't just a person. He is a lens. He's the lens through which a huge part of the founding story of Islam is viewed. But that lens it's colored. It's colored by politics, by the limits of oral memory, by 7th century gender norms, and by the imperial anxieties of his day.
He's the bridge from the prophet to the empires that came after. But the bridge itself is swaying a bit.
And we have to walk across it. That's the challenge of doing history. We rely on these narrators, they're all we have. But we have to remember, they were people. They lived in specific places, under specific rulers, afraid of specific things.
It really makes you wonder, how much of what gets called divine law is actually just what Abu Sa'd remembered?
Or what he was allowed to remember.
That's the thought I want to leave everyone with. You mentioned he lived under the Umayyads, and that created a political filter.
Yes.
So here's the what if. What if Abu Sa'd had moved to Kufa, which was a Shia stronghold, instead of staying in Medina? What if he had died 10 years earlier or lived 10 years longer? How different would the religion we have today actually look?
If the filter changes, does the faith itself change? It's a massive question.
A massive question. One small change in the network and the entire output is different.
Thank you for walking us through this. It was incredibly complex, but necessary.
It was my pleasure.
And to all of you listening, thanks for sticking with us through the tough parts. We will see you on the next Deep Dive.